All right. One thing I forgot to do at the end of the last lecture is to give you the answers to the Lecture 2 note sheet. So I'm going to do that right now if you want to grab that. And we'll go over that. Number 1 on your note sheet there, Lecture 2, Germany Triumphant. Number 1, after Hitler conquered Czechoslovakia and Poland, Stalin felt that Finland is the answer. Finland posed a potential threat. Number 2, the Finns used guerrilla warfare tactics as well as innovation to fight the Russians. Number 3, one reason Stalin invaded Finland was because he wanted control of the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea. Number 4, two key events which underpinned Soviet suspicion of Finnish intentions were, number 1, the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria in 1938. Number 2, a German delegation celebrated Finland's 20-year anniversary over communism. Number 5, Stalin's ultimatum to Mannerheim negated any further chance that Finland could maintain neutrality or remain neutral. Number 6, prior to actually invading Finland, the Soviets tried propaganda to increase diplomatic pressure. Number 7, Stalin offered to trade tundra in the far north for the crucial Karelian Isthmus. Number 8, General Kirill Meretskov was initially tasked with invading Finland. Number 9, the bombing of civilians in Helsinki aroused international anger and solidified Finnish resistance. Number 10, Finland's finest hour during the Winter War was the Battle of Sulsami, and that's a tough one to spell. It's Suomussalmi in December 1939. Number 11, the manner in which Finnish troops ambushed clogged Soviet columns has been often compared, and I didn't talk about this in the lecture, but nonetheless, compared to the Roman slaughter at the hands of barbarians at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. Number 12, Finland's National State Liquor Board invented the Molotov cocktail in December 1939. Number 13, Soviet General Timoshenko is credited with reforming the Red Army and preparing it for the coming invasion of Russia. Number 14, the boarding, I'm sorry, that number 13 should have been reforming the Red Army and preparing it for the reattack into Finland. Number 14, the boarding, and I'll fix that, the boarding of the German ship Altmark convinced Hitler that the British desired Scandinavian iron ore, ORE. Number 15, the Norwegian campaign was codenamed Operation Weser, W-E-S-E-R. 16, as a result of German victory in Norway, Winston Churchill replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister. Number 17, Fall Gelb, G-E-L-B, was the code name, the German attack on Western Europe. Number 18, the German generals tasked with leading 3 army groups to the Meuse River were von Bock, B-O-C-K, von Rundstedt, R-U-N-D-S-T-E-D-T, and von Leeb, L-E-E-B. Number 19, the Allies erroneously assumed Germany's plan to attack Western Europe would mirror the Schlieffen Plan of World War I. Number 20, the Maginot Line was a series of fortifications which France thought impregnable. Number 21, Operation Sickle Stroke involved the Germans driving through the Ardennes forest. 22, the Belgian fortress known as Eben Emael, E-B-E-N, and then E-M-A-E-L, was crucial to the defense of the Low Countries. 23, German Fallschirmjägers, or paratroopers, used a new weapon on the Belgian fort called shaped charges. Number 24, Lord Gort is credited with saving the BEF at Dunkirk. 25, Operation Dynamo was the code name for the evacuation at Dunkirk. 26, as Hitler approached Paris in the summer 1940, Paul Reynaud recalled French hero of World War I, Marshal Philippe Pétain, to boost morale. Number 27, after France surrendered, the southern portion became known as Vichy. 28, General Jodel's plan to invade Great Britain was called Operation Sea Lion. 29. In order for the amphibious landing in Britain to be successful, the German Luftwaffe must control the English Channel. Number 30. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring was in charge of the Luftwaffe. Number 31. Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding is credited with helping to develop radar. 32. Sir Winston Churchill secretly hoped the London Blitz would evoke sympathy from the United States. Number 33. Churchill's comment, "It was our finest hour," refers to the Battle of Britain. Okay, so we are going to, I wanted you to get the notes for lesson 2 there. And also, one other thing, I mentioned this last time when we talked about the Afrika Korps, if you remember. This is one of my prized possessions in my collection, but this is a German Afrika Korps pith helmet that was worn, and as well as the goggles. This is completely authentic, and you can see the German pith helmet for the Afrika Korps. This is what they wore to keep the sun off their heads and stuff. Soft cap. It's got this green and cloth interior, almost made out of cork, and so forth. So that's the Afrika Korps pith helmet, sun helmet. Put that over there. Okay. If you want to bring the slides up for lesson number 4, lesson 3, actually, we are going to talk about the Eastern Front, the Russo-German War, which went from 1941 to 1945. And in this lesson 3, will have to be probably a 2-parter as well, because I usually go about 30 minutes and then cut it off and make another video. So if you want to go to slide 2 there, with me there, follow along. More than 2,000 years ago, King Solomon wrote, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, "Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall." And perhaps in no other example is this verse more prescient than in the adventuristic German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. Considered the largest land invasion in military history, Hitler's aspirations to expand German living space, or Lebensraum, to the east constituted a monumental overreach that left an indelible stain upon the German people, which time itself cannot erase. From the summer 1941 until the spring of 1945, both nations, Germany and the Soviet Union, battled it out like a couple of weary prize fighters struggling to stay standing. Arguably, no other theater in the entire war evokes more emotion, more excitement, more interest than the events that unfolded along more than a 1,000-mile swath of territory stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This immense killing ground was called the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front is particularly significant for several reasons. For one, it represents the largest land invasion in world history to this day even. One can comb the annals of antiquity and not find an invasion comparable to the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The sheer scale alone makes this event noteworthy. Millions of troops, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and an immense land mass provided the arena for the two greatest totalitarian powers of all time to tear at each other's throats with a level of savage ruthlessness that causes even the most hardened warrior to shudder. Because of its magnitude, military historians have and continue to view this immense conflict as a treasure trove of information from which valuable material is available. Everything from the Holocaust to street fighting in Stalingrad to the largest tank battle in history owes its genesis to this astonishing confrontation. The Russo-German War, also known as the Great Patriotic War by the Russians, and by the Germans, the Ostfront, represents the high water mark in man's inhumanity to man. The German decision to break the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invade Soviet Russia was not made in a vacuum. On the last day of July 1940, the receding prospects of Operation Sea Lion prompted Hitler to announce for the first time to his army chiefs of staff his decision to invade the Soviet Union. German Army Chief of Staff, a man by the name of Franz Halder, was personally present when Hitler announced to his generals this plan. And Halder notes, his notes, which I have perused, they were recovered after the war, reveal not only that Hitler had made a definite decision to attack Russia in the following spring, but that he had already worked out in his mind his major strategic aims. Britain's hopes, Hitler said, quote, lies in Russia and America. If that hope in Russia is destroyed, then it will be destroyed for America also, because elimination of Russia will enormously increase Japan's power in the Far East. The operation, Hitler said, would be worth carrying out only if its aim was to shatter the Soviet nation in one great blow. End quote. Next slide. Arguably, the primary reason the Germans failed to shatter the Soviets in one great blow has been explained by none other than one of Hitler's top generals, Erich von Manstein. In his book, Lost Victories, the war memoirs of Hitler's most brilliant general, how's that for being humble? Manstein gave his opinion on why Operation Barbarossa failed. Quote, the first mistake was committed by Hitler in underrating the resources of the Soviet Union and fighting qualities of the Red Army. He based everything on the assumption that Russia could be overthrown by military means in one campaign. While his strategic policy was to demolish the Soviet system, his political actions were diametrically opposed to this. The second factor was the failure to achieve a uniform strategic policy between himself and the Army High Command. End quote. Next slide. If any single Bible verse comes to mind regarding Germany's invasion of Russia, it's the one that we just read, Proverbs 16:18. Pride goeth before destruction, haughty spirit before a fall. After Hitler launched the invasion of Russia, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, the average German soldier started to realize that I'm not the Superman that everybody thinks I am, and the Wehrmacht is not invincible after all. In fact, threatening to send a German soldier to the Russian front was usually effective in straightening out bad behavior. They were terrified of fighting the Russians. The Russians were not soft, peace-loving people like the French, like Western Europeans. They were hardened, rough. They were used to enduring incredibly harsh living conditions. And while they may not have been as high-tech as the German army, their ability to withstand colossal punishment made them a formidable adversary indeed. And when the war in Europe was nearly over, German troops literally ran into the waiting arms of American soldiers to surrender, rather than be taken prisoner by the Russians, because the Russians usually didn't take German prisoners, preferring rather to execute or torture them to death as payback for the 1941 invasion. Next slide. So let's examine what led to the Russo-German War. After the French collapse in June of 1940, neither signatory of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was really satisfied. When Russia invaded Finland in November of 1939, the Winter War, Germany saw this as a threat on the raw materials that Finland could supply to Germany. In early April of 1940, the Russians reacted to the spreading German influence in the Balkans by signing a treaty with Yugoslavia. I mentioned that earlier. Hitler then invaded Yugoslavia on April 6, 1941. And while this seriously worried Stalin, Stalin still upheld his end of the pact and continued to deliver the needed raw materials to Germany. In fact, on the very day that Germany invaded Russia, a Russian transport train was pulling into a German train station carrying grain, coal, oil, cotton, and so forth. And the German sentries, the guards, instead of saluting, their Russian counterparts, instead opened fire on them with submachine guns. And this marked the opening shots of what would become the Great Patriotic War to the Russians and Operation Barbarossa to the Germans. To say that Hitler double-crossed Stalin is a gross understatement. Hitler despised such Stalin and all that he stood for. And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was simply a political expedient so Hitler could prolong a two-front war and do what he wanted in the early part of the war without Russia interfering. It also allowed an exchange between the two nations of some vital raw materials. In fact, by 1940, Soviet exports into Germany made up about 66% of all of Germany's key war assets. And on the very day Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, Russia had already delivered to Germany 2.2 million tons of grain, 1 million tons of oil, and 100,000 tons of cotton. Next slide. Hitler had actually begun planning this offensive, this invasion of Russia, as early as July 1940, while the Battle of Britain was winding down. And by December of 1940, he issued his famous Führer Directive Number 21, which on paper established the basic plan for Operation Barbarossa, named after Frederick Barbarossa, a medieval emperor who led a German contingent east during the Third Crusade. Next slide. And before we get into the thick of it, we really need to ask and answer the question as to why Hitler would choose to invade the largest country on earth. Aside from his strategic aim of getting Britain out of the war, which I mentioned earlier, it was purely ideological. Remember, Hitler despised Soviet ideology, Bolshevism. Number two, he wanted to expand Lebensraum, living space. And number three, he wanted to exploit the opportunity to exterminate those that he felt were responsible for Germany's defeat in the Great War, i.e. the Jews. Next slide. So at 0300 hours on the 22nd of June, 0300 hours is 3 a.m. for those of you that are unfamiliar with military time. At that time, 0300 on June the 22nd, 1941, 120 German divisions, that's like 3 million men, 3,500 tanks, 600,000 vehicles, and 7,200 guns, or artillery pieces, blazed across the Russian border, much to Stalin's surprise. By the way, Hitler chose June the 22nd because that's the very day that Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. You know, Hitler was all about rubbing it in the face of his enemies. Interestingly, General Heinz Guderian, the famous tank general of the Wehrmacht, criticized Hitler in his book that he wrote after the war, and he criticized Hitler because Hitler kept back 13 divisions in Norway that could have been used for Barbarossa. Next slide, slide 9. Operation Barbarossa was a significant turning point for the war for four main reasons. Number one, it introduced Germany now had to fight a two-front war. Technically not yet a two-front war in June of 41, but it would be by November of 42. Number two, it introduced the world to wholesale genocide, such as has not been seen before. Number three, like all wars, it spawned innovation, technological innovation. Confronting the Russian T-34 tank caused German designers to develop a superior tank, which ended up being the Panzer VI, or the Tiger tank, which, of course, as we said last time, annihilated U.S. troops at the Battle of the Kasserine Pass because of that fearsome shell that the Tiger fired. Remember that, the 88 millimeter. And number four, it humbled German soldiers. Prior to the shots fired, there were several assumptions and missteps made by both sides that are worthy of discussion. So we'll talk about the Nazis first. Number one, slide 10. First, the Germans assumed their adversary were racially inferior and would not fight for Stalin's Bolshevik ideology. Of course, Bolshevism came to power in Russia during the Russian Revolution of 1917 and founded the Russian Soviet Federalist Socialist Republic, which would later become the Soviet Union in 1922, founded by Lenin. Bolshevism was a major organization consisting primarily of workers under a democratic internal hierarchy governed by the principle of democratic centralism, who considered themselves the leaders of the revolutionary working class of Russia called the proletariat. This, of course, clashed with fascism, so we have a classic case of conflicting ideologies that's going to fuel this conflict. Second, the Germans failed to appreciate the sheer magnitude of Russia, the magnitude of this vast, immense Russian steppe that made up Russia. The border, in fact, the border that separated the two nations stretched 2,000 miles. That's from Lancaster to North Carolina, just to give you perspective. When General Heinz Guderian first heard of Operation Barbarossa, he had been summoned to a planning meeting by Army Chief of Staff General Halder, and Guderian said, quote, "When Halder spread out a map of Russia before me, I could scarcely believe my eyes," end quote. Next slide. Also, General Guderian, one of history's greatest tank leaders, advocated a deep penetrating strike with his panzers straight into the deepest reaches of Russia. Guderian was an ex-cavalry officer in World War I, and he saw no reason to have to wait for the infantry, which would only slow the advance in his opinion. But Hitler and the other military planners were not ex-cavalry, they were ex-infantry, and so they couldn't get a grasp on Guderian's vision for his panzers, his tanks. Interestingly, Guderian authored the book Achtung Panzer in 1937, in which he described what he believed were essential elements for a successful tank or panzer attack. Unfortunately for the German High Command, they didn't heed that advice. One nation that did, however, was post-World War II Soviet Union. And during the Cold War, which lasted from 1947 to 1991, the Soviets dusted off Marshal Tukhachevsky's writings and formulated a deep penetration doctrine called deep battle. It was this strategy that caused the United States to base so many U.S. forces in Europe during the Cold War years. And NATO were concerned that the Russians would follow it up with a lightning-fast penetration of mechanized vehicles deep into the rear and headquarters areas of the United States. And this is classic deep battle doctrine. Next slide. Third, the German intelligence had no clue as to how large of an army, how well equipped the Russians were. And because Hitler watched closely as Finland gave the Russians a bloody nose during the Winter War, Hitler became convinced that the Wehrmacht could conquer Russia before the winter set in. And therefore, he sent his troops in the summer of 1941 into Russia without any winter clothing or equipment whatsoever, because he didn't expect the operation to last that long. And what ended up happening was the supply train, the logistics trail, if you will, from Germany to the troops in Russia only was about 500 kilometers. Anything beyond that, Germany was unable to supply their men. Next slide. Fourth, another fly in the ointment, if you will, was in the higher than expected efficiency and quality of the new Russian T-34 tank. It was not until Operation Torch in North Africa that the Tiger tank was able to be used with any effectiveness. General Guderian, in his book Panzer Leader, published in 1955, stated that, quote, "The main German battle tank employed in Barbarossa were the Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. Unfortunately for the Germans, a T-34 could knock out a Panzer III and IV from about 1,200 yards away with no problem." Next slide. In August of 1942, the Germans unveiled their infamous Tiger tank, arguably the best tank of any nation in World War II. As in every war, technological innovation is always a byproduct. Now, next slide. Regarding Stalin and the Russians, there were some assumptions as well. First, Stalin repeatedly ignored intelligence warnings from the West as well as his own intelligence services, thinking that they were trying to, pit the two leaders against one another. A defecting German communist tried to warn Stalin on literally moments before the invasion began, he swam across the Bug River and with his hands up said, "Hey, we're going to invade you any time now." And instead of listening, they shot him. Stalin had an agent, an intel agent, a spy, if you will, named Ricard Sorge, who also tried to tell him. Even his own military leaders tried to warn him. But Stalin, adamant, refused to believe them. He refused to believe that Hitler would violate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Second, when German troops and armor began concentrating on the border in Poland, Stalin just dismissed this as spring war maneuvers. Third, the purges that Stalin made to his own military starting in 1937 resulted in the Red Army's leadership being comprised primarily of new and inexperienced officers. So all his veteran guys were either dead or freezing in some Siberian gulag. Next slide. As Germany made preparations for this massive invasion, the largest land invasion to date, it was important for Hitler to instill his own ideological ethos or bent philosophy into his leaders and his troops. So before the invasion, Hitler was quoted as saying, quote, "Once we kick in the door, the whole rotten structure ruled by Jewish subhumans will come crashing down," end quote. One of Hitler's side objectives for Barbarossa became the wholesale extermination of every Jew, every political commissar, every gypsy, or any undesirable living in the Soviet Union. And so to accomplish this heinous goal, Hitler's SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler was appointed the task of overseeing the extermination of all Jews. And to assist him, he directed, next slide, this man, Reinhard Heydrich, known as the Blonde Beast, to put together a special task force of German troops known as Einsatzgruppen. Following the German occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939, Heydrich was given a post in Prague as Reich Protector. On May the 27th, 1942, two members of the Czech resistance ambushed Heydrich's car as it rounded a corner in Prague. And although he wasn't instantly killed, he suffered wounds from grenade fragments and ended up dying on June the 4th, 1942, the same time that the Battle of Midway was climaxing. And of course, this assassination became known as Operation Anthropoid. Slide 18, next slide. The Einsatzgruppen were nothing more than a death squad, a killing squad, who followed the initial wave of army troops, regular infantry, into Poland and the Soviet Union and sort of went village by village and rounded up and murdered innocent Jews, innocent civilians. Next slide. On September the 29th, 1941, at a place called Babai Yar, a ravine in Kiev, a squad of Einsatzgruppen murdered 34,000 people in just 2 days. Eventually, these mass shootings began taking a psychological toll on many of these SS troops, so a more thorough, industrialized means of getting rid of the Jews had to be conceived. And just 3.5 months after Babai Yar, a meeting was convened to develop a solution, a final solution. Next slide. On January the 20th, 1942, a high-level gathering of Nazi officials took place in a Berlin suburb called Wannsee. This has been known as the legendary Wannsee Conference. And the purpose of this conference, which was called for and chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, was to ensure cooperation and coordination from various German departments to implement the final solution, which is more commonly referred to as the Holocaust. The conference was attended by 15 senior Nazi bureaucrats and marked a real turning point in Nazi policy toward the Jews. Now, prior to this, forced emigration was tried, and even the idea of deporting all Jews in Europe to Madagascar off the African coast was even discussed. Of course, that didn't happen. And when it became obvious to Hitler that deportation, ghettoization, and even pogroms, an organized massacre of a particular ethnic group like the Jews, when it became apparent to Hitler that those were not working, were not efficient enough to get rid of Europe's 11 million Jews, the Wannsee Conference outlined the plans for the final solution. And during that conference, which only lasted 2 hours, euphemistic language was used and thrown around the table to relay what the Nazis had in store for the Jews. And so the final solution would involve the following. Number one, it would involve rounding up all Jews throughout Europe and evacuating them. That was the euphemistic word used, via railway, evacuating them eastward, which was a euphemism for throwing them onto cattle cars against their will, separating them from their families, and taking them to the gas chambers. Number two, organization into labor gangs, euphemism for concentration camps. And the work and the living conditions would be, it was theorized by Heydrich and the rest of the Nazis that the conditions would be so horrendous at these concentration camps that alone would eliminate large numbers of Jews because they would starve to death or they would be worked to death. And then eventually, those that did survive would be treated accordingly. What that meant was, that was a euphemism for systematic murder by gas. And so, if you're in class, if we were in class right now, I would show you a video clip from a movie known the movie was called Conspiracy, and it dramatizes the Wannsee Conference. Next slide, slide 22. Himmler directed Adolf Eichmann to oversee the transportation of Jews to the death camps throughout Germany and eastern Poland. And now, rather than have young SS officers, young Einsatzgruppen, shoot hundreds of civilians a day, the Jews would now be shipped via rail car to concentration camps where they would be gassed and then cremated to the tune of 6 million. Next slide. It was Eichmann who actually masterminded using railroads to bring the maximum amount of Jews to the camps as possible. We're going to stop there. We're going to pick it up at slide number 24, and we'll finish lesson 3 next time.